the NASA Shuttle Enterprise. This is episode 50.
You're listening to 70s Trek with Bob Turner and Kelly Casto, the fan podcast that looks at Star Trek in the 1970s. It was the decade that built a franchise.
It was the moment in the 1970s that Star Trek became a cultural phenomenon. I'm Bob Turner.
And I'm Kelly Casto. NASA's first space shuttle was renamed Enterprise in 1976 to honor the show and its impact on our society. We'll tell you how that happened on this episode.
But first, let's remind everyone how they can find us. You can visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/70strek. While you're there, we hope you'll leave us a question or a comment.
You can also send us an email to 70strek@gmail.com. You can also find the show on iTunes by searching 70s Trek in the podcast section. When you're there, please leave us a rating or a review. When you do, it helps other people find our show.
Well, you know, Cal, I can remember as a young boy, let's see, I was 13 years old. As a little kid, I was fascinated by the space program and Apollo. And I remember sitting in front of the TV in 1976 watching the space shuttle roll out of the hangar and was mesmerized by how different this thing looked.
I know. It looked just like, well, it looked kind of like an airplane, but not.
But different.
But different, yes.
That's right. Well, why don't we dive in? Kelly, why don't you tell us a little bit about the history of the space shuttle program to start off with?
Sure. So the original concept can be traced back to the late 1930s. The Nazis developed this program or this project called America Bomber. And here the idea was that basically a winged rocket capable of carrying bombs, and it would cross the Atlantic so they could drop bombs on the U.S. Fortunately...
So it was all about just getting us.
Yeah, basically.
Nice.
Prepping for when we entered the war. Fortunately, they never got that project off the ground. However, the United States did get their hands on this idea at the end of World War II when the mission known as Operation Paperclip, I like that name, brought over many of the German scientists. So the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics and NASA's predecessor, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, they were so excited about this idea, they basically launched a series of studies to, pursue this idea. One of the end results of this was the X-15 rocket plane.
That was incredible. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have seen film of the X-15. That's the one that just looks like a rocket. It's like dark navy blue or black, and it's got little wings near the back, or in the middle, rather. And it was really just what you said, right? A rocket plane.
It was a rocket plane. It did reach an altitude of 62 miles, which technically they made it to space.
Yeah.
And it got up to a speed of 4,520 miles per hour.
Wow.
And they did several test flights with the X-15 between 59 and 68. Now, the Air Force, not to be left out, the Air Force was developing a space plane as well. Now, the design of this space plane, or the X-20, or the Dinosaur.
That's a great name.
Isn't that awesome? Unfortunately, they didn't really get this project off the ground too far. It was canceled shortly after construction began in 1963. Then Northrop Corp, they built a plane for NASA to study, and it was the HL-10, and the HL stands for horizontal landing. And they built it for NASA so they could study how this low lift overdraft vehicle, I just want to make sure I got that right.
Well, this is the lifting body test, right?
Right.
Yeah, this is the one that has the round body underneath. And simply by towing it, and I think isn't there film of like a Chrysler towing this thing, right?
Yep. Yeah, it's like a Chevy or old Chevy.
Yeah, right. It's like burning up down through the desert.
Yeah.
Towing
I think
this
they
thing.
called it the flying bathtub.
They did. Yes, they did. And it was, they were doing experiments on bodies without wings, that just the shape of it by itself would create lift.
Right. So we could look at these three different programs the United States was working on, the X-15, the X-20, and the HL-10, as basically the foundation for the Space Shuttle program.
Neat.
Now, the Space Shuttle program really is part of a larger space exploration vision, which was established by German rocket engineer Werner von Braun. And this space exploration vision really is known as the von Braun paradigm. Now, von Braun, I think we've talked about him before, was one of the Germans brought over from this Operation Paperclip. And what he states in his paradigm is that he saw space exploration in sequential steps. First, you put a human in space. Then you have to develop a reusable spacecraft. It has to be something that reduces the cost of the space travel because you're going to do it constantly. The vehicle is then to be used to help create or build a space station. Then you inhabit the space station, and it helps you launch missions to the moon, Mars, whatever.
Oh my God. That's really incredible. And we've seen most of these steps, I should say, come to pass.
Right. Absolutely. All but really the last step.
All but the last step. Yeah. Isn't it amazing? Von Braun was a V2 rocket scientist who was all about getting man off of Earth and exploring space. Even as a V2 engineer, really he was doing it to develop, rocket technology.
Yeah.
For him to sit down and be able to write out these steps looking into the future, and they're the steps that we do follow because everybody else thinks they're the right steps too, I'm impressed. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah. And what a visionary.
Yes. I'm sorry. I keep interrupting you. Go ahead.
That's fine. This is a fun topic.
It is.
So NASA really, they embraced von Braun's paradigm. But in the 60s, we got a little sidetracked with this little thing called the space race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so the goal was, put that all aside. We got to get to the moon. 1969, President Nixon realized that, the Apollo mission is coming to an end soon. And what are we going to do after that? So he establishes a space task group to kind of figure out what that direction is. Now, this group, they envision going back to the von Braun paradigm.
Great.
With a goal to get to Mars.
Great.
If you look at the time, and I don't have figures, but because budget numbers bore me, but Nixon and Congress or whoever else kept cutting NASA's budget. And it was, NASA's budget was a significant part of the United States budget overall. It was something like 5% or something. And they kept whittling away the budget. So he's like, nah, this is going to be way too expensive. You got to cut it down. You got to focus on something. And so they gave him a choice, or the choice there was a space station or a reusable space vehicle. And they chose the space shuttle.
Sure, that makes sense.
So really, back in 1969, the shuttle program really began. By January 5th, 1972, President Nixon announces officially the Space Shuttle program to the nation. And in his address, he stressed that this would allow the U.S. to get to space more frequently without the huge costs, and it would be a stepping stone to get us to the other things. But we got to get this one stepping stone out of the way first.
You know, when you think about what was going on in the late 60s with Vietnam and how much debt the country was accumulating between Vietnam, the Great Society, and the Apollo program, all of a sudden we are taking on debt like crazy. It cost billions to get to the moon in the 1960s. And billions, you know, they don't have the same meaning, or they didn't have the same meaning then as they do today. No. It was a lot bigger number. And so, yeah, I can completely understand why, hey, we've gone to the moon. Can we cut this stuff out now? I can completely understand why people sort of were looking at that and feeling that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to have that end goal, but you got to have, you know, a narrow focus, especially when you're talking billions or trillions of dollars.
Yeah. What are we doing with this afterwards, and how will it serve the nation? And I think that's what people were trying to figure out.
Yep. So the Space Shuttle program is now official. It is known as the Space Transportation System, or STS. And so if you see the Space Shuttle missions, they all start with STS-01, 02, never 13. I won't go into that naming structure, but they decided to change the naming structure before they got to 13, not to coincide with Apollo 13. They didn't want any bad luck, I guess. The design of the shuttle, now it had to be a balance of capability, development cost, and operating costs. It's basically the three legs of the stool.
So it had to pay for itself in a sense.
Basically, it had to pay for itself. Every aspect had to be looked at financially and be sound.
You know, I've heard it called a space truck, which is kind of what it is, isn't it?
It is.
It was designed to carry payloads that would help pay for itself.
Yeah. So one of the initial designs that I kind of liked, it sounds futuristic, but it was kind of not kind of. The design was a vehicle that would basically fly to space as a rocket, and then on the way back, it would deploy jet engines, so they'd kind of fold out, is how it was described. And on reentry, or not reentry, but in landing, it would use jet engines to help land. Then it could also, since it had jet engines, it could move from place to place. So if it lands at Edwards Air Force Base and needs to get back to Florida to launch, it could fly itself. That proved to be pretty expensive, and that idea was scrapped. So what they came up with, as we all know, but I'm going to read this NASA speak. So sorry.
Okay.
I love NASA speak. The final shuttle design consists of the orbiter vehicle, or the OV, a pair of recoverable solid rocket boosters, or SRBs, and the expendable external tank, ET, containing liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. The shuttle would be launched vertically like a conventional rocket, with the two SRBs operating in parallel with the OV's three main engines, which would be fueled from the orbiter's two orbital maneuvering systems, OMS, engines. At the conclusion of the mission, the orbiter fires its OMS to deorbit and re-enter the atmosphere. The orbiter would then glide to a precise horizontal landing.
Written like an engineer. And who was at NASA? A bunch of engineers.
Yes.
Wow.
All the way up through the administration.
Yep.
By July of 1972, contracts were awarded, and then construction started in 1974. In August, though, and this is a very important moment in the program, August 1973, the Martin Marietta X-24B proved the concept of unpowered reentry and landing which is used in the shuttle design, basically gliding.
So this was another prototype vehicle that was proving the concept?
Exactly.
Oh, cool. Okay.
The first shuttle was then produced, and really it was a prototype vehicle to be used primarily to verify the performance of the Space Shuttle orbiter's design during its final approach and landing.
Yeah, let's talk about that first shuttle, shall we?
Sure.
It was due to roll out on Constitution Day, which was September 17th in 1976. That was the bicentennial year, if you remember. So NASA decided to name the shuttle the Constitution. And that makes perfect sense. I can see that. This is where it gets interesting, though. There were two fans who had this idea that the shuttle should be named after the Enterprise in Star Trek.
Who could that be?
I know. Well, over time, these two fans, their names have kind of been lost. Like, I've asked around, and nobody seems to remember who they were. But they
Kelly
reached out. Yeah, right. Right. But they reached out to Bijo and John Trimble. Now, we all remember them from the letter writing campaign in 1968 that really got Star Trek a third season.
Yes.
I checked with a source, Chris Gardner, who freelances for Star Trek Magazine, and he had some additional info. And I also was fortunate enough to speak to Bijo Trimble herself while I was preparing for the show.
Unbelievable.
I got lucky. So she doesn't remember the names of either man either. So I apologize if you guys are ever listening to our show. I can't find your name. Please contact us.
Yeah, drop us a line.
We'll re-edit it. So
email.
She did remember the details of the campaign, though. So let's talk about that. When these guys reached out to her, they wanted to know the details of the 1968 campaign because they thought, well, we'll get a letter writing campaign going, get letters sent into NASA and the president. Maybe we can get this thing going. So they wanted to know what the process was. And Bijo very graciously said, sure, here it is. Shared the process with them. And this was around 1975, but they strayed from the process and began to add to it and made it too complicated to the point that they were having a hard time getting it going and getting people to respond. So sometime around March 1976, these two guys drop out of the campaign altogether.
Oh, no.
And they send Bijo a box in the mail that contained everything that they had done so far, which according to her wasn't much. So,
oh, jeez.
Bijo and John, they weren't sure that they wanted to do this. You know, they only had 6 months, all right, and it was a lot of work. And they were also raising a family at this time. They had young kids, and they really didn't want to disrupt their family life.
Right.
But upon reflection, and this is how she described it to me, they both decided that NASA needed some help. You know, just from what you read a few minutes ago, they weren't very good at PR. In fact, they were horrible, and they were dull, and they didn't get people excited. And as we spoke about a moment ago, too, people were asking if the expense of space travel was really worth it. And there wasn't a lot of excitement around NASA in the mid-'70s. So Bijo and John felt that, you know what? Maybe changing the name of the new space shuttle to Enterprise would help get the support for the shuttle program and NASA. That's really why she got involved. It wasn't, yes, there was love for Star Trek, but that wasn't the driving reason. It was also a love for NASA. So Bijo rallied the troops and got into action. And obviously she knew what to do because of that 1968 campaign. She still had a mailing list from that time with thousands and thousands of names on it. So she invited a large group of volunteers over to her house, made some spaghetti, she said, and put people to work. Now, I was really curious, what was the process? How did you do this? And gosh darn it, she was nice enough to tell me. So this is her process. The campaign did not use form letters. In other words, just the same letter copied, thousands or millions of times. She knew that those would be discounted and probably ignored, and that would really cut the credibility of this whole campaign. So instead, she created instructions that informed others how to write their own business-style letter to President Ford and NASA. And she also instructed these folks on using the Rule of 10. That involved the recipients mailing the instructions that they received from Bijo out to 10 other people, and then asking them in turn to mail those instructions out to 10 more people, and so on. And you can see how this thing exploded exponentially, and it spread very, very quickly.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, it really, really is. Well, after they got the initial letters mimeographed, they had a mimeograph machine in their basement. Her volunteers stuck them in envelopes, sealed the envelopes, put stamps on them, and sent them out. It was a very manual process, and it really, this whole idea, this campaign, really depended on the goodwill of those who received the letters to take action. And they did. President Ford and NASA received between 400 and 500,000 letters and phone calls between March and September 1976. White House advisors cited hundreds of thousands of letters from Trekkies, and they called them one of the most dedicated constituencies in the country. They called Trekkies constituencies.
Wow.
I know. Now, this is kind of interesting, too. Wait a minute. Let me do that again. This is noteworthy, too. Ford did not publicly mention the campaign. He didn't want to say, I changed the name because of a bunch of Star Trek fans. But instead, he said, I'm partial to the name Enterprise, when asked publicly why the name changed. So there you go. That's sort of the story of how the campaign worked out. Bijo and John were invited to the rollout then in September. And they were asked, what would you like to do? Where would you like to sit? And they were kind of like, what? They were being treated like dignitaries, and they weren't even aware of it. So NASA offered them press passes, and this is kind of unprecedented. So they got to sit. So they got to sit where the press sits, right there, right beside the hangar. The VIPs were about 500 yards away in front of a stage. Right. This is a neat story here, too. The night before the rollout, there was a reception, and Bijo was invited. John didn't get there. And she tells me that during the reception, aerospace engineers would quietly come up to her and flip over their suit jacket lapel and show her Star Trek buttons. Quietly telling her, we are so behind this. This is awesome. So on the day of the rollout, there's Bijo sitting right by the hangar. And when the doors opened and the shuttle rolled out, she remembers that the paint used to paint the name Enterprise on the shuttle looked fresh. She remembered it looked new, it looked fresh. And as the Enterprise rolled out of the hangar, the Air Force band played the theme from Star Trek.
No way.
Can you imagine that? And over in the VIP section in front of the stage, Gene Roddenberry and all of the cast, except William Shatner, were there watching, excited, loving it. Later, George Takei described that moment as deeply, deeply moving for all of us. I can only imagine. It must have been incredible.
Oh, yeah. Well, in that famous picture you see.
Yes.
Just Gene standing there. He looks like a proud papa, doesn't he?
Yes. And when you think about what he was going through at that time in the mid-'70s, and we've talked about it, his career wasn't on fire at this point. He was searching for a Star Trek vehicle or some idea to bring Star Trek back. So it was a tough time for him personally and professionally. And to have this happen, boom, wow.
It had to re-energize him.
Absolutely. It had to re-energize him. To me, this was the moment. In the 1970s, that Star Trek moved from a canceled, in the red, dead TV show to a cultural phenomenon. And I know I've said that in the intro, and I'm saying it again, and I just can't hammer that fact home enough. This was the moment that the country knew, wow, this Star Trek thing, it must be a big deal. I mean, has anything like this, Kelly, ever happened to another TV show or a movie or a book that you can think of?
I can't think of any to this magnitude.
Yeah, I agree. I think this moment sets Star Trek apart from every other entertainment vehicle out there. And this is when Star Trek's return really started. How can you not be a Paramount exec, see this happen, and not think to yourself, wow, we got to get this Star Trek thing going?
Yeah, jump on the bandwagon.
Right. We got to get this going.
Yep.
All right. Let's go back to the rollout ceremony. This is an incredible story. B. Joe recalled that as they're watching the Enterprise roll by, an astronaut came up to her, and she can't remember which astronaut it was, but someone identified as an astronaut came up to her, and she says that he resented her and told her so for organizing this letter writing campaign, and that he went on to say that ordinary citizens should not have a part in any of this. Now, she was a little taken aback by that, and she said that she didn't do it for the love of Star Trek, but for her love of NASA and her desire to help, and that without ordinary citizens being involved in supporting the program, I mean, after all, it is tax dollars from the citizens.
Right.
This thing would never get the funding in Congress that it needed. And Bijo says that the astronaut paused for a second and said, well, then maybe I owe you an apology. And walked off.
She told him.
She did tell him. So after the shuttle is kind of rolled out and it stops and they're taking pictures, there is a bit of a ceremony. And the keynote speaker was Senator Barry Goldwater from Arizona. Now, he didn't know that the Star Trek cast and Gene Roddenberry were seated right in front of the stage. And George Takei recalled that he made some joking remark about the shuttle being named after a TV spaceship. And he said, well, maybe we should start recruiting more pointy-eared astronauts. Leonard Nimoy stood up, smiling, raised his arm, gave the Vulcan salute, and said, well, Senator, I'm here. Takei remembers that Goldwater was speechless, pointed at Nimoy, and said, oh, Spock! I love that story. Well, Senator, I'm here. Nimoy was on his game that day.
Yeah, he was. So was Bijo.
Yeah, right, exactly. Let's jump forward almost a year to August 1977. That's when Enterprise flew on her first mission. She was taken aloft on the back of a 747 and separated, and the test was, can she glide back to Earth and land? And, of course, that test was successful. Do you remember watching this?
Oh, yeah. A friend of mine and I, we were camped out in front of the TV. We couldn't wait. All week we were waiting for this.
Yes, it was incredible. I can remember watching this thing. You separate, come flying in, and you were like, oh, my God, that's what it looks like in the air. That's incredible. And she landed. Applause, band playing. It was a big deal. It was a huge test.
Yeah. And just, really, you don't get the size of it until you see the chaser planes flying next to it.
I think when it's on the ground and people are walking around her, oh, boy, do you get the size of it then.
Yep.
Well, this test and the ones that followed proved that the shuttle's design would allow it to fly in the atmosphere. And at the conclusion of this testing, Enterprise was supposed to be retrofitted for space flight. When it was rolled out And during these tests, it did not have the reaction control thruster packages. Those are the things that cause the shuttle to pitch and yaw back and forth. Those weren't included. It also didn't have engines in the back. They were just mock-ups. And so the original intent was do the tests, bring it in, retrofit her, she'll be ready to go for spaceflight. But between the rollout of the Enterprise and the rollout of the next shuttle, Columbia, there were some significant changes made in the design, including things like the weight of the fuselage, and even the design of the wings had changed. And so retrofitting Enterprise would be really expensive, more expensive than building a new shuttle. So in October 1979, Enterprise was partially disassembled, and certain components were used in other shuttles. So you could say, in a way, she did fly in space.
Yes, parts of her.
Just parts of her, yeah. In 1985, Enterprise was stored at the Smithsonian Institution's hangar in Washington, D.C., and she stayed there until 2003, after the Columbia disaster. At that time, she was used for tests to determine exactly what happened to Columbia. And they shot sections of foam at her hull and sides to see what kind of damage was created. They were kind of trying to figure out what happened to Columbia and using Enterprise to test those things out. In 2012, Enterprise was moved to the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum, where she rests today. Now, I just want to say before I wrap, the shuttle was so revolutionary that the Russians developed their own version of it. And it was called the Buran, B-U-R-A-N, Buran. Yeah, whatever. And it looked exactly like the U.S. shuttle. I'm not talking, it kind of looks like the shuttle. It looked exactly like the shuttle, to the point where it had the black underneath, the white on top, the same delta wings, the same tail, and the configuration for launch was exactly the same as well. They copied it.
So did they reverse engineer it, or did they get planned somehow?
Great question. And I don't know that anybody has that answer for sure. But this was built around or just before the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so that program really never took off and really never did anything. There was only one, I think, ever built and tested. To wrap up, I just want to talk about the welcome ceremony for the shuttle at the Intrepid in 2012. Leonard Nimoy was there, and he had this to say. He said, "For me, this is a reunion. 35 years ago, I met the Enterprise for the first time. What a great day that was in 1976. We, the cast of Star Trek, were invited to be there. It was a great day for America and a great day for us to be connected to that history, and I'm very grateful." Next week, we talk with two people who saved Star Trek.
Don't miss our interview with Bijo and John Trimble.
Thanks for listening to 70s Trek, an independent fan production. Join us next week as we explore more about the production, the actors, the producers, and the influencers of Star Trek in the lost decade of the 1970s on 70s Trek.